Welcome to this fifth lecture on the philosophy of nonviolence. I am Dale Snowert, Professor of Peace Studies and Education at the University of Toledo. This lecture will discuss the basic elements of nonviolent resistance. As we've seen in the previous lectures, there are 5 elements of the philosophy of nonviolence. Today's lecture is having to do with the nature of nonviolence as direct resistance and conflict transformation, in particular the basic elements of that resistance. From the perspective of Martin Luther King, as we've already discussed, resistance to injustice is active, as he states here in an address he gave in 1957. The nonviolent resistor is just as strongly opposed to the evil against which he protests as is the person who uses violence. This method is passive physically but strongly active spiritually. It is non-aggressive physically but dynamically aggressive spiritually. End quote. And that's a basic element of nonviolence, that it is not passive, it's very active. It's an active resistance to injustice. Nonviolent resistance also does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent. It seeks to win friendship and understanding. It also is a means to awaken a sense of moral shame in the opponent. Its end is redemption and reconciliation rather than domination or conquest. It seeks to awaken, to understand, and to awaken the conscience of the opponent, that is, the oppressor. Its resistance to injustice is not focused on persons or people. It's not focused on the oppressor as a person, but the resistance is directed against the evil itself rather than against persons trapped in that evil. As King suggested, it is evil we are seeking to defeat, not the persons victimized by evil. This was often expressed as to hate the sin, not the sinner. That is, to keep the persons involved immune from resistance. So it's not the people per se that we're resisting, it's the injustice itself. Nonviolent resistance also prominently features critique and dissent. A basic element of nonviolence resistance is public social criticism and protest of unjust laws, social structures, customs, and practices. A central initial form of resistance is critique and dissent, including protest. King and Gandhi and others were aware that the oppressor will not, most likely the oppressed will not voluntarily act to remove the structures of injustice. They will not by themselves move to transform the violent structures of the society, because those structures serve their interests. So a feature of nonviolent resistance is that it must be demanded, change and transformation must be demanded by the oppressed. It seeks, the nonviolent resistor seeks negotiation with the oppressor, to sit down at the table and to negotiate in a diplomatic sense changes in the law, changes in custom, changes in public policy. But the nonviolent resistor recognizes that negotiation may not always be readily available. And in order to compel the oppressor to the negotiation table, not a part of nonviolent resistance is to create disruption, to create a crisis, and to foster tension in the community, often by economic boycott, etc. And this disruption, this fostering of tension and crisis in the community through protest, through criticism, through nonviolent resistance, creates a situation which compels the opponent to come to the negotiation table. Central to nonviolent resistance is the element, a very basic element of withdrawal of consent. And this notion of withdrawal of consent is based upon a conception of power as consensual. Gene Sharp writes, I quote, all nonviolent struggle has a basic assumption in common, and that is its view of the nature of power and how to deal with it, end quote. Sharp again, quote, the belief that the exercise of power depends on the consent of the ruled, who by withdrawing that consent can control and even destroy the power of the opponent, end quote. So central to nonviolent resistance is the withdrawal of consent, and that withdrawal of consent of the rule shifts the power dynamic. It rebalances power, and this can occur because power is ultimately consensual. So non-cooperation and disobedience as forms of resistance are grounded in this idea of the withdrawal of consent of the governed. This idea is in contrast with the command obedience conception of power, which views power as the capacity to compel the will of others. The consensual theory of power suggests that power is derived from the consent of its subjects. That is, a ruler's power is generated from the acceptance and affirmation, that is, the consent of the people, that the people hold ultimate power. They're the ultimate power holders. And therefore, when they withdraw their consent through non-cooperation and disobedience, civil disobedience, that diminishes in the power of the ruler. It shifts the power dynamic. And this shift of power dynamic through withdrawal of consent is at the core of nonviolent resistance. Another basic element of nonviolent resistance is the force of love, brotherly love, or agape, and from Gandhi's perspective, the force of truth. So King argued that the center of nonviolence at the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. Love not as sentimental, but love as a connection, a deep connection and concern, and a recognition of the moral standing and dignity of others, which in an ancient Greek word of agape. It's different from eros or romantic love. It's also different from philia, which is the intimate affection between friends of reciprocal love. Agape is a kind of brotherly and sisterly love, non-sentimental, wherein we recognize the worth, value, dignity of others, and that motivates our concern and respect for those others. In a similar way, Gandhi argued in terms of the force of truth, or satyagraha, as the primary force behind nonviolent resistance. And for Gandhi, the truth is that we are fundamentally interconnected, that there exists a basic unity between all persons that results in mutuality and reciprocity, or should result in mutuality between persons. This, for Gandhi, is the highest truth, and nonviolent resistance relies on our fundamental unity and interconnection with others. So nonviolent resistance from this perspective is grounded in agape, brotherly love, and the force of truth. Nonviolent resistance also involves what Martha Nussbaum refers to as transition anger. Of course, injustice results in the feeling of anger. To be a victim of injustice is to be harmed and to be dehumanized. And the natural response to that dehumanization is a feeling of anger. When we are disrespected, our natural emotional response is one of anger and indignation. Anger is a signal that our dignity has been violated. But nonviolent resistance rejects the anger, the idea of anger as revenge or payback, and nonviolent resistance must go beyond anger as payback into constructive work and hope. And this is the idea of transition anger. Transition anger has three valuable roles to play. It's a signal that that some wrong has been done to one, both to the oppressed and to others. A recognition of wrong, of injustice, and it also provides motivation to protest and struggle against injustice, as well as to communicate the injustice to the wider world. As outrage, indignation, anger is right. It expresses something true. But the rejection of revenge, of payback, in the idea of transition anger is predicated on love. If we maintain brotherly love or sisterly love, agape, in the context of injustice, then we can tap into the power of transition anger and not be caught in the destructive cycle of revenge. Of course, this requires, and it's well recognized, that nonviolent resistance requires self-purification, self-knowledge, self-development. And this is recognized by King and Gandhi, but it's also recognized by the Dalai Lama, who wrote, quote, "Peace in the world thus depends on peace in the hearts of individuals. This in turn depends on us all practicing ethics by disciplining our response to negative thoughts and emotions and developing basic spiritual qualities, end quote. To engage in nonviolent resistance requires that we have purified to a significant degree our emotional life, our emotional responses, so that we can that we are at peace with ourselves and that we can transcend the negative emotions of revenge, hate, and fear and payback. Therefore, quote, we disarm ourselves internally through countering our negative thoughts and emotions and cultivating positive qualities. Lasting world peace will only be possible as a result of each of us making an effort internally. Afflictive emotion is the oxygen of conflict, end quote. So the transformation of injustice through nonviolent resistance requires that we engage in self-reflection, critical self-examination, and to purify our afflictive emotions, our negative emotions. Nonviolent resistance also relies on the power of suffering. That is, suffering on the part of the nonviolent resistor. The perception in the opponent of the suffering of the nonviolent resistor standing up against violence and in absorbing that violence disarms and imbalances the opponent. It's a kind of moral jiu-jitsu wherein uh, the balance of power is shifted through the absorption of the blows, the violent blows of the opponent. Suffering also awakens the moral conscience of the opponent, allowing for the opening of a bridge to reconciliation. It also exposes injustice, magnifies the injustice of the oppressor. So when the oppressor attempts to stifle the nonviolent resistor through violence, that highlights or further exposes the injustice of the oppressor. Suffering also calls attention to the moral rightness of the cause of the nonviolent resistor, and it speaks to the decent but silent majority. When the decent majority sees the nonviolent resistor as suffering at the hands of the oppressor, then the sympathy shifts from the oppressor to the nonviolent resistor among the majority, the silent majority, thereby shifting again the balance of power in favor of the nonviolent resistor, in the sense that the majority now becomes an ally of the resistor. There are numerous ways in which nonviolent action is enacted. I believe Gene Sharp, for example, has identified over 200 types of nonviolent action. Some of them are listed here. Protest and persuasion is a beginning point, as we've discussed. Non-cooperation, withdraw from the social system, is another method. Economic non-cooperation, economic boycotts, strikes, etc. Political non-cooperation is fundamental action, direct action, rejection of authority, non-cooperation with the government, Also, rule departures by government personnel are a form of nonviolent resistance, and prominently, a prominent type of political non-cooperation is civil disobedience. That is, the intentional breaking of unjust laws to call into to bring attention to the injustice of those laws. We will discuss at length the idea of civil disobedience in the next lecture. Various types of nonviolent intervention can also be employed: psychological, physical, social, economic, and political. In summary, the basic elements of nonviolence, nonviolent resistance to injustice includes resistance and non-cooperation, awakening of conscience, one's moral sensibility. It's focused on injustice, not persons. It relies on the forces of love and truth. It engages transition anger. It relies on self-purification, critical self-examination, and self-purification. It utilizes the power of suffering. It promotes critique and dissent. It engages in disruption in order to facilitate negotiation. It fundamentally engages withdrawal of consent based upon a consensual notion of power, and that withdrawal of consent shifts the balance of power, leading to negotiation and transformation, and a recognition that there are multiple forms of direct action, of nonviolent direct action, that often the type of direct action that's required is contextual. That is, it's based in the particular social, economic, and political circumstances within which the action is occurring. So nonviolent resistance, having these basic elements, can take multiple forms. Thank you very much.